All right. So hopefully you all can see me. I certainly can't see you. This is Mark Costers, and I'm here to talk about engineering matters. And I'm speaking to you in Chantilly, Virginia, at ARIN's offices. And let's go on to the first page here. Next slide. So here you can see our agenda, and our agenda is, ARIN is engineering is actually working on 4 things right now. It's a 4-pronged approach. We're working on tech debt, which I'm not going to talk about so much here, but I am going to talk about the IRR update and statistics, RPKI update and statistics, and finally directory services and its statistics. And what's interesting about this is there's a lot of interesting behaviors here, some of which I really don't understand, and maybe you can help me understand a little bit. Next slide, please. So as you all know, we rolled out a new IRR that lives beside the old Internet Routing Registry on June 10. So we now have 2 sources of information. First of all, we have ARIN, which is indicated within the regional internet routing system as by its source. And we have 2 sources that actually come from our database. The first source is ARIN, which is comprised of authenticated IRR objects. These things are tied to the networks of which you hold. ARIN non-auth is essentially the old system where there are non-authenticated objects or objects that from organizations that are not under contract. So we have 2 separate routing registries here, both of which are published from ARIN. So the authenticated side is truly authenticated against ARIN's resources, and only those users can actually put routes and Route 6 objects based on their network space that they have within it. And you can do that via 2 ways. One is if you had an existing maintainer before we did the transition on June 10, you could use the template system, or if you come in since June 10, you can use our web interface, which is new. Now, ARIN non-auth still exists. It only exists for those who had maintainers before June 10. It will no longer, can you create new maintainers in the space. It has no authentication of objects, much like the old IRR did, and you can only use the template system. Also, one of the things I will say, jumping back to ARIN's authenticated side, is that once if you were an old system on June 10 and you decide to use the web interface on June 11, from that point onward, and there's adequate warnings that were put into place that you are then graduated from the template system into the web UI system. So anyways, that's one thing I wanted to make clear. So, and since June 10, we've put out numerous incremental improvements, and we continue on. So let's go on to the next slide, please. So what we're planning on doing right now is we are making sure that all the staff actions that are done, like transfers or changes in ARIN's registry, are also reflected in IRR. So for example, if the space that was once held by an organization that's transferred to RIPE, all those routes and Route 6 objects, et cetera, are going to be removed as part of the transfer. So as well as getting new space or giving space to someone else, those routes are going to be removed if they existed prior to the transfer. So one of the other things that we're working on is focusing in on a new RESTful API. We're looking at the existing APIs that are out there and trying to do the best thing that the community would expect. And it's going to be integrated within our existing RESTful interface system called Whois-RWS. And you can anticipate seeing it in January 2021. Next slide, please. And here's where things start getting interesting. And as you can see here, you have this sort of blue-green line, which is the old IRR, the ARIN non-authenticated IRR. And then you have the darker blue line that is authenticated IRR. And as you can tell, the maintainers that transition that were available on the old IRR, there's 2,268, and it graduated by 800 to a little over 3,000. And of course, there was a corresponding drop within the legacy or old IRR. Next slide, please. But this is where things get kind of interesting. Is you would think that the old IRR, the non-authenticated IRR, would start having a drop in the number of routes. That is certainly not the case here. You can see that it increased by almost 10,000. Likewise, if you see here, the number of authenticated objects also increased by a good number as well, so 8,000. So this is one of the things I found fairly surprising when I went ahead and did the graphs for this. Next slide, please. Route 6 objects is slightly different. Here you can see that the non-authenticated portion of the IRR has been essentially flat, but the number of IRR objects that are in the authenticated side went up by almost by a huge amount, by almost 4,000 routes. So definitely Route 6 is definitely is preferred by the new authenticated IRR. Next slide. So here you can see our RPKI statistics. One of the things that we've put out is we put out a new HSM. The 4765 that we had before has been replaced by IBM 4767. And we did this because the old system was end of service, end of life. We had to import this new system from Canada, which was interesting, and had to go through a way of moving through one country to another requires a sort of an importer that it's acceptable by the US government, which we did, and which was kind of interesting, but it happened. And we are able to bring these things in-house and actually deploy these things. So when we did this, we actually implemented a very simplified interface to our new HSM and removed many of the architectural limits that cause restrictions in various areas. For example, one of the things that we had with the old system is that we could only have a few numbers of ROAs that could be deleted at one time. That has now been changed. It's a much higher number. It's not unlimited, but it's certainly much higher. We also had a restricted number of manifests that we could actually create in the old system. That is now gone. We have limits, but are still working on upping them over time. So for example, if you want to delete more than 20,000 ROAs at one time, go ahead and contact RSD. Now, right now, there's no one organization that has more than 6,000 ROAs. So I don't see this as really a problem at the moment, but this is something that we are actually working on. Next slide, please. So our challenge here was the initial rollout was very smooth on August 12, 2020. We tested the code and it worked great against the ARIN's RIPES validator and NLNet Labs Routenator. And when we deployed, all the tests and all the websites were green and everything was golden. But within an hour, we received notifications of validation error reports from those people who use the Fort and OpenBSD RPKI client. We then worked with the OpenBSD folks with our own engineers to dissect what was actually going on, and actually found a very small encoding error that we had to fix. This is fixed within 24 hours. It was a fairly obscure thing, and we were very happy on the efforts that the OpenBSD folks had to help work with us, because that greatly reduced our time to figure out what the heck was going on. As we went through this process, we discovered that there's many different validators that have different ways of interpreting these crypto objects that come out of the RPKI system. This led to a very significant discussion within the IETF, which is the internet standards body for the internet, on how to handle these errors. And frankly, there was no good or firm conclusion on the best way forward within the IETF. And this is something that we're looking for guidance from the IETF. So lessons learned here is we've tested against 2 validators, but we need more. We need to go beyond what RIPE and NLNet Labs have. We are going to list those sites that, list those validators that we've tested against on the ARIN website. And we will also have monitoring expanded to include multiple validators as well. Right now, every time we deploy a new update to the RPKI system in terms of putting out new data, new ROAs, everything else, we actually revalidate it to make sure it's correct before we push it out. And we'll include beyond the existing validators we use today, which are RIPE and NLNet Labs validators, we'll go ahead and start looking at others as well. Next slide, please. Here you can see our statistics that I've brought up many times in the past. And the interesting things I'll mention here is in May, we had a significant uptake from the number of people who are using delegated. It was 1 or 2 for years, but it jumped up to 8, and it's because of a new delegated system called Krill that's available by NLNet Labs that people started experimenting with. Right now we have 9 delegated people actually in the system, of which 5 have, it's a 2-step process where first they say, I want to run delegated. And then the second thing they do is say, here's the cert that we're presenting to you to set up our RPKI service. That second step has only been accomplished by 5 of the 9 people. So there's essentially, even though there's 9 that said that they want to join in the delegated system, there's only 5 that are actually playing with it today. The other thing that's of interest is you'll notice from May of 2020 until September of 2020, we've had a huge uptake in a number of ROAs and also covered resources. So you can see that RPKI system is starting to take off. Next slide, please. Now what I want to switch to is our directory service systems, which is comprised of Whois-RWS, and RDAP, and to a lesser degree, our Whois. Much of our staff time is actually spent on these systems. We have pretty heavy use on these systems. Occasionally we have alarms going on these systems from people hammering them quite hard. And we spend a lot of time diagnosing what the problems are and figuring out how to solve it. This is also the largest use of our resources. We have 3 what we call public facing sites, PFS sites, that serve up multiple iterations of these servers. So there's 3 main sites, and each site has 6 or more instances of these engines running on these boxes, all sort of behind load balancers so that you don't see when 1 goes down or 2 goes down or whatever else. All this is transparent to you. But you can see that this is a pretty significant amount of resources. And these are not small boxes. These are fairly beefy boxes. Next slide, please. And you can see that we are seeing traffic unlike what we've ever seen before in a consistent basis. You'll see that in 2010, we had a spike. And it was a very bizarre spike. And it was something dealing with some changes made with various people using OpenID software for some reason that they were actually coming and actually doing a query against us, find out who that client was. And that was a mistake, and that was taken out. And the social media sites that have used it have soon found a different way of actually finding out who they're actually talking to. Now it's a slightly different story where these are more consistent. You can see on the blue line how we've actually gone up on Whois traffic, and you can see that Whois-RWS has also seen a sizable increase as well. Next slide, please. And here's our RDAP statistics. It also is growing. You can see that at one point we had a peak on traffic, a little over 200 queries per second, and that was a spike and has come down. But now we're starting to see steady growth again against RDAP. And what was interesting here is that we're seeing close to 200 queries, well, 175 queries per second against our RDAP nodes, most of which are on V4, very little on V6. Most are on V4, and it's about 4% on V6, and the rest are on V4. And what's interesting here is that people are starting to use RDAP, and ours, from the sharing that we've done with the other regional registries, we are by far the highest trafficked site for Whois-RWS, and RDAP in terms of number of queries seen. For example, APNIC is seeing a third of what we're seeing today, if not more. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So my question is, why do we see such an increased use? Do people not understand or know about getting our data in bulk via bulk Whois? Maybe the other thing is people legitimately need the data, but they need it in real time. And there's a couple of cases of that. Maybe people are servicing trademarks or some sort of DRM sort of technologies that need to see these things in real time. Monitoring for illegal use of copyrights and so on. It could be for inventory management. Who knows? That we've also seen malicious bots, and we've seen widespread activity against malicious bots. And then there's also other things, and I've brought this up in the past, of people using recipes via cloud services to harvest Whois data. And there's one case in particular, Mark's blog, and no, it's not me, but a different Mark, he came up with here's how you go ahead and set up Amazon Web Services, and here's how you get data from ARIN, and how you can really sort of blast them to get all the data you need. So the end result is we spend a large part of the time actually tuning our systems to deal with the increased load. We've done a lot of code efficiency works, we've done a lot of OS tuning work, and we've also increased the use of tar pitting on our load balancers. Essentially, if they come over a particular query threshold, we put them in the slow lane, and after a period of time, they keep out that traffic, we actually start dropping them off on terms of their queries. Next slide, please. So with that, any questions?
Any questions from Mark? Mark, you already have a question, so why don't we go straight to it, and I'll ask everyone to quickly queue up, and we are going to go quickly into open microphone as well. So the first question is from Mike Mazurek. Does the HSM and the crypto security have any commonality?
The HSM and the
crypto security have any commonality was his question.
Boy, that's sort of an interesting question. So the HSM is essentially what it does is it creates two things, keys and also signatures based on those keys are other keys. And so it's essentially a signature generator and also a signature signer. And so those things are high security modules and hardware security modules, whatever you want to call them. And they're actually out there for people to use.
Thanks, Mark. I don't see any other questions burning. However, Mark's going to stick around, as are all the presenters who are in this afternoon. And with that, we'll open it up to open microphone.